In this video, I'm going to talk about sourdough starter. There's a lot to talk about with starter, so I'm just going to go over some basics. I'll talk about what starter is, some basic methods of using it and some tips for using it, and then a few notes about its flavor. I'm not going to go over starting a sourdough starter from scratch in detail, but I do have a recipe to do that posted on my website, and I'll share a link to it in the video description. So what is a sourdough starter? It is basically a mixture of flour and water, and it has a population of microorganisms living in it. And these microorganisms are both yeasts and bacteria. The yeasts and bacteria that live in there have the ability to take sugar and process it into different organic molecules that produce flavor and also carbon dioxide gas. And because they have this ability, it means that they can be used in bread making. So sourdough doughs usually rise more slowly than doughs made with baker's yeast. An estimate is 2 hours for a full rise instead of 1 hour, but obviously that depends on a few things. The dough also might not be as puffy and gassy as you're used to if you've been working with yeast. It's just sort of like, it's still rising, but if you poke it won't like just totally collapse, and it might seem more stiff and just less obvious when it's fully risen. So to create a starter, you basically just leave out a mixture of flour and water, and microorganisms that are nearby will move in and take up residence, and you have to keep feeding the mixture more flour and water so they have something to eat, but over time a stable population will develop. What microorganisms you get in there can vary, and different ones will produce different flavors in your final bread. So there has been a long time debate over where the microorganisms come from. For a long time it was believed that it was the location where the starter is created, that they're in the air, or that they're on the hands of the baker. There's also evidence that they're in the flour. And then also the process that is done to create the starter might affect what ends up in there, because different acidities, different temperatures favor different microorganisms. There's a citizen science project that's done at NC State, and I recommend you look it up. They had people all over the world send in samples of their sourdough starter and also information on how they created it, and they were able to analyze the samples and figure out exactly what yeasts and bacteria are in there. And so they have an interactive map, and you can click on it, and there's different yeasts listed, and you click on one kind of yeast, and then all the places in the world where there was a starter with that yeast will pop up. And just in general, as I clicked through it, if I clicked on a certain yeast or bacteria, little dots would pop up kind of all over the globe. Some of them were only in one person's yeast or one person's starter or two people's starter, but the ones that appeared in several starters did seem to just be spread out around the world. So I might be misinterpreting it, but to me that suggests that it's not the location where the starter is created. I don't know where they were created. It's possible that they were all made in one place and then carried throughout the world. I did not have that information, but that doesn't seem to be what the map is saying. So I encourage you to check that out, and hopefully there will be more results from that lab for us to look at. When you create a starter, and it's just a newborn baby starter, it will have a very mild flavor. And then as you feed it, more deeper flavor will develop over time, and so eventually it will get stronger and more sour. This is true up to a point, but if someone tells you that their starter is 50 years old, that's very cool, but it won't necessarily have more flavor than a starter that's, say, 5 years old, because there is a point it reaches where it stops changing. Another debate about starter is the stability of the microorganisms in the starter system. So if you make a starter in San Francisco, or if you send away for a mail order starter that is San Francisco sourdough starter, and you bring it to North Carolina and start using it regularly, does it stay the same over time, or do the North Carolina bacteria and yeasts move in and kind of take over? There is a 1971 study that has evidence that the microorganisms are stable. And this is because of both the acidity of the mixture favoring the critters who are already in there, and then also the fact that the microorganisms have a symbiotic relationship between the yeasts and the bacteria that helps them thrive and helps them resist outsiders. I've talked to people who insist on both scenarios, people who have bought multiple different starters and keep them in their fridge and say that they make all different flavors of bread, and then other people who say, I've bought them so many times and they always end up tasting just like my North Carolina starter. So once you have a starter that is fully grown and you're feeding it regularly and using it to make bread, there's sort of a cycle that it follows, and if you've never done this before, it can be a little bit confusing. But first, just imagine that you don't have a refrigerator. So you take your starter, you feed it some flour and water, you leave it out on the counter. If it's just normal room temperature, in about 8 to 10 hours, it will have processed that new flour and be fully risen and just all full of gas. And I would call that starter ready. You always want your starter to be ready to use and filled with gas before you make bread with it or before you feed it. And so I've met people who say, well, my starter dies, it always dies, and I take such good care of it, I feed it all the time, I just kept feeding it and feeding it. And basically they were not waiting for it to be ready before they fed it, and so when you feed it, you dilute the population of microorganisms in there, and you basically kind of move back toward just having flour and water. But there's a few microorganisms, and they multiply and then start producing gas, and you get your fully formed starter again. So if you feed it when it's not ready, you basically just keep diluting it, and you'll dilute it down until you just have flour and water again. So you just always want it to be ready to use and filled with gas before you feed it or before you use it in bread dough. So every time you feed your starter, you might notice that it's going to get bigger and bigger because you keep adding flour and water to it. So ideally, when you feed it, you take half of it and use it to make your loaf of bread, and then you only feed the other half, and that way you always end up with the same amount of starter. If you need to feed your starter and you don't want to make bread, the alternative is to take half and compost it or throw it out and then feed the other half. So I said that the starter is ready every 8 to 10 hours after you feed it. And obviously you don't want to have to feed it every 10 hours forever. So this is where your refrigerator comes in to slow down the starter so that you can feed it less often. So after you feed it, let it sit out 1 to 2 hours to give it a little head start rising, and then put it into the refrigerator. The cold temperature will cause its activity to slow down and then eventually stop. So now when you need it, you pull it out of the fridge and let it warm up, and as it warms up, it will resume its rising. And you just have to try to judge when it is fully risen and ready to use and filled with gas. So this can be a little bit hard to do because, after it's been in the fridge, sometimes it will have sunk, or especially if it's been in the fridge for a while and you're trying to assess where it's at, it can just be hard. So I always err on the side of letting it over rise. So I will, pull it out the night before and just let it sit out all night, even though I know that's going to be longer than what it needs. And it always seems to work. And also when I was in the bakery, our starter was always ready at 5 a.m., but we would use it throughout the day, and it worked just fine in the breads that were made later in the day as well. And so that's why I think it's better to just let it over rise, because it doesn't just die suddenly after it reaches the ready point. So as far as how often you have to feed a starter when it's being kept in your fridge, in theory you can use it every week and make bread and feed what you have left, but I personally do not make sourdough bread that often. So with me, it's more like a monthly feeding. And often when I pull it out of the fridge, the top of it will be like a little crusty or kind of hard. And it will sometimes even be like starting to get a little dark in color, which is not really great looking. And what I do is I scrape off that top and compost that. And then the part that's underneath always looks fine. And that is what I feed. and save. There's a book by Andrew Whitley, and he says that you can go years without feeding your starter, and the underneath part will still be good. I have not tried that, but I have gone 4 months when I simply had a lot of life stuff happening and got busy and forgot about it. And it was like he said, you know, the top looked kind of bad, but I threw that out and the underneath part recovered just fine. You know, just one extra feeding and it was back to normal. So because my starter often has been in the fridge for a month, when I pull it out, even though that bottom part, you know, still looks good and still has life in it, I don't want to use it to make bread because it probably doesn't have the full population of bacteria in there, and if you just used it straight to make bread, it might not rise very well or it might just go very slowly. So what I do is I do an extra feeding before I make the bread. So pull the starter out, let it sit out overnight to warm up and keep rising, and then the next day I throw out the top, feed the rest, and then I just let it sit out on the counter and rise for 8 to 10 hours. And you know, usually it just poofs right up, and so I know that it's still good and it still has life in there. And then I split it again and make my loaf of bread and feed the rest to return to the fridge. So I keep my starter in this glass bowl, and it has one of those silicone lids on it. I used to use plastic wrap, and that's fine too. I just saw this and I wanted to stop wasting plastic wrap. Canning jars also work with the lid on, but you want to cover it because if you don't, the top will dry out really badly and just become very hard. But you don't want to seal it too tightly. Just remember, it is producing gas, so you don't want to seal it so that you cause something to explode in your fridge. So finally, I'm just going to talk about starter and flavor. We already mentioned that the age of a starter can affect its flavor, where a baby starter will have a mild flavor, and then as the months pass, it gets stronger, and that happens up to a point. Which bacteria you have in there also can determine what flavor you have, and that might be beyond your control. But there are some things that you can control. So the first one would be the time that your dough is rising with the starter in there. So if you make a dough with sourdough starter, kind of a standard is you make the dough, you shape it into whatever your ball or your baguette, and then you let it sit overnight before you bake it. And that produces a nice flavor. If you wanted a milder flavor, you could just take that shape and let it rise and then bake it the same day, and that would reduce the flavor. And then you could also let it sit in the fridge for 2 days and then bake it, and it might not rise as well after that longer time, but the flavor you should notice will be more developed. Another thing you can do if you want to make it rise just a little bit longer is use less starter. And I know that sounds a little anti-intuitive, that less starter is going to result in more flavor, but it's because less starter means it will take longer before it is filled with gas and ready to shape or ready to go into the oven, and therefore that longer time creates more flavor. So different consistencies of starter supposedly can also produce different flavors, and I don't have any personal data on this. I have heard some people say that a wetter starter gives a more acidic flavor. What I would suggest, if you're interested in this, is to try both. Whichever stiffness of starter you have, just split it in half and start feeding it with a more wet or more dry recipe, and so you end up with 2 different starters, one that is more stiff and doughy and one that is wetter. And just bake 2 loaves and compare them. You'll have to adjust the water content in your recipe, but I would just suggest trying that and seeing which one you like better. Also, different temperatures can favor different bacteria, and again, I don't have personal data on this, but what I've heard is that a colder temperature for the dough rising will give a harsher or more acidic flavor to your final bread. You might not have that much control at home because you probably just have one refrigerator that's 40 degrees. But again, it's just something to experiment with and see if there's a flavor that you like best that comes from letting your dough rise at a certain temperature.